Welcome to Kern Airmanship Model in Detail. Tonight's webinar is going to focus on the ultimate capstone outcome, judgment. I'm Dave Cook. I'll be your presenter this evening. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Airmanship Excellence. And this is session 11 of 11 in the series. So this is the last session in the Kern Airmanship Model in Detail series. I see everybody on the attendance roster this evening has attended at least one of these webinars before, so I'm going to dispense with the control panel briefing. However, I would like to ask everyone who's attending this evening to please raise your hand by clicking on the raise the hand icon so I can check the audio. Great. All right. I see everybody is in the loop. And in addition to the FAA FAST team, another webinar sponsor this evening is the Center for Airmanship Excellence. And as you know, this is a Wings program webinar, so you will receive one knowledge credit for attending this evening. And since all of you folks have attended webinars before, I won't spend any time here except to remind you, if you haven't registered yet for your free airmanship updates at the Center for Airmanship Excellence website, I suggest you do so you can stay in the loop. Things are happening. And I'd also like to remind you that if you have not yet completed the Redefining Airmanship webinar series, the 6 sessions, or all of the Kern Airmanship Model in Detail webinar series, I'd encourage you to do that if you're serious about pursuing airmanship excellence. And a quick overview of the whole series here so we can orient ourselves this evening. We started out with an overview of the Kern Airmanship Model. Then in session 2, we took an in-depth look at flight discipline. 3 was skill. 4 was proficiency. And of course, flight discipline, skill, and proficiency are our bedrock principles. And then in 5, we took a look at self, knowledge of self, and in 6, knowledge of aircraft, knowledge of team, knowledge of environment, and then in 9, we took an in-depth look at knowledge of risk, and those, of course, are our 5 pillars of knowledge in the Kern Airmanship Model. And the last session, we took an in-depth look at situational awareness, and in this session, again, we're going to look at judgment in detail, and that caps out the 2 capstone outcomes. So that will be the whole Kern Airmanship Model in detail when we finish up this webinar. And of course, you all know that this is my personal pre-flight checklist, and I advocate that we all use this. Ask ourselves the question, if I don't fly right, should I even be out here trying to aviate at all? And again, just a quick reminder here, again, because all of you have attended before, you know this series is based on the Kern book, Tony Kern book, Redefining Airmanship. And it was written in 1997, published in 1997, and we kind of look at it on this book as the Bible of airmanship, if you will. And just for review, let's take a look at our shared definition of airmanship. Again, from Kern's point of view, it's expert airmen possess discipline, skill, and proficiency. Expert airmen have a thorough understanding of themselves, their aircraft, their team, their environment, and the risks they face. And expert airmen consistently display exceptional situational awareness and use good judgment at all times. And we've all agreed as we go through these webinars that this is our shared definition of airmanship. And if you're viewing this webinar for the first time of all of them in the series, the recording of this webinar, I'd encourage you to go back and start at the beginning, because this is what it's all about right here. We want to be expert airmen. If we want to possess airmanship excellence, this is what we have to do. And I also like to remind everyone that, really this Kern Airmanship Model is the scaffold upon which we build our airmanship skills and capabilities. It's the framework. There's a lot of details in here that we haven't talked about in this webinar series. We've talked about a lot of details. But it's we really look at the model itself as just the scaffold for all of this. And again, quick review of the model. Bedrock principles of flight discipline, skill, and proficiency, upon which rests the 5 pillars of knowledge: self, aircraft, team, environment, and risk. And resting upon the 5 pillars of knowledge are the capstone outcomes of situational awareness and judgment. And as I always like to say to myself again, the other way that you've all heard, if we practice consistently and diligently the bedrock principles of flight discipline, skill, and proficiency, while always striving for a more perfect knowledge of ourselves, the aircraft we fly, the team we operate with, the environment we fly in, and the risks we face, then we can expect the capstone outcomes of ever-improving situational awareness and judgment. And of course, we're here today to talk about judgment. So let's start drilling down now on the ultimate capstone outcome, judgment. Before we do, I have a quick question for you. Let me launch it. Stand by one. Okay, right now at this point, how would you self-assess your judgment when you normally fly? And just select all that apply here. Okay, looks like everybody has voted. I will close the polls and share the results with you. So a third of you think it's excellent. Good. Good enough, 67%. I know that's kind of a vague answer because, good enough means you're safe. I sometimes doubt my judgment. That's a good, honest answer because we all should doubt our judgments. Part of the process, trust but verify, as Ronnie Reagan used to say. And I think it needs improvement, and it's a third of you. And I would say to all of you, it needs improvement. All of our judgment needs improvement. It needs to be constantly improving. But that's good. I can see that everybody's starting to really get into all of this airmanship talk. So I'm going to hide that, and we'll move on. Well, Charles Gow said about judgment is not the knowledge of fundamental laws. It is knowing how to apply a knowledge of them. So we don't really have to know everything. We just have to know how to apply these laws. Kern says, good judgment sits at the pinnacle of airmanship. All other factors like discipline, flying skills, knowledge, and situational awareness support good judgment. Good judgment, in turn, supports all 3 major goals of airmanship, and those goals are safety, effectiveness, and efficiency. And those goals are important not only to us individually as aviators, but also they're important to the flight organizations within which we fly. Here's a personal view on judgment from Dr. Richard Jensen. He's the director of the Ohio State University Aviation Psychology Laboratory, and he actually, if you will, wrote the book on pilot judgment. I'm being somewhat facetious because there have been many books written on pilot judgment, but this book is called Pilot Judgment and Crew Resource Management. And Kern quoted this in Redefining Airmanship, so that's why I'm showing it to you here. There is a certain truth to the popular belief that judgment is just common sense applied to decision-making. However, sense must imply knowledge and intense awareness, realization, and in-depth understanding of all the factors involved in the decisions. Like the wise man once said, common sense isn't all that common. So if this is what you mean by common sense, however, sense must imply, if you have all these airmanship things we've been talking about, then that's common sense. But if you don't have that, that's not really what we're talking about here when we say common sense. Judgment, like all other aspects of airmanship, must be viewed holistically, and that means as an interactive part of the airmanship whole. So none of this stands by itself. It all fits together. Judgment is demonstrated in almost everything an aviator does, like applying simple rules and procedures. That's judgment. Routine situations, we use judgment in routine situations. Tackling and solving complex in-flight emergencies. Now this is usually where we think we put our airmanship, judgment into work. But it's all these other areas too. It even extends beyond the cockpit to include adequate mental and physical preparation for flight, briefings, debriefings, and critiques. So judgment applies in all of these areas. As the pinnacle of a complex human equation, understanding and improving judgment requires a solid foundation of airmanship knowledge and a process for study and improvement. So it takes both of those. It takes that solid foundation of airmanship knowledge, and that's what we've been talking about here in all these elements, and especially the 5 pillars of knowledge of the Kern Airmanship model. And then again, as we've been talking all through this series, all of that's good and fine and dandy, having all that knowledge and the skills and the proficiency and so forth, but you must have a process for study and improvement, a continuous process. So let's take a look at the scope of poor judgment. And what's poor judgment doing to us as a pilot community? What can it do to us individually? And let's look at the scope of all of that. Stand by just 1 second, please. There we go. I had to reconfigure my control panel. I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see there. Poor judgment has a significant impact on all areas of aviation, not only our personal flying area of aviation. The tragic results of poor judgment are in evidence in nearly every accident study conducted in recent years. And again, depending on whose statistics you want to believe, 70 to 90% of all aviation accidents are caused by pilot error, which generally is attributed to poor judgment, one way or another. In one 5-year study of general aviation accidents, decisional errors accounted for more than 50% of the fatals. So that means that, that it can kill us quicker than some other things. This is one of the big killers is pilot error, decisional errors. And here's a graphic look at all the types of errors that they're talking about here. You can see procedural errors were down around 5% of all the errors. Perceptual motor skill errors down around 40%. Excuse me, and this is where you see a lot of your loss of control on takeoff and landing. But the decisional errors accounted for 50% of all the fatals. So this is what we're talking about here with airmanship, because all of the airmanship things we've talked about, the Kern Airmanship model, everything feeds into decision making. We want to make this better to bring this accident rate down to next to nothing, if not nothing, in this column for those of us who practice airmanship and the quest for airmanship excellence. Now, a 10-year analysis of military human factor errors associated with mishaps identified 3 areas of poor judgment as causal factors more frequently than all other types combined. That was selecting the wrong course of action. So all of our decision-making process, our judgment process, as part of that process, there are alternatives, and we have to select alternatives. And if we select the wrong one, it can end up looking like that C5 right there. Intentional failure to use accepted procedure. And this is, if you recall, back when we were talking about situational awareness and cues, caution warning lights, if you find yourself not using the prescribed procedure, making up your own procedure for whatever, normal operations or emergency operations, that's a red light to you, and here's why. Because this is the type of thing that has led to all these accidents, more than all the others combined. And the third one is delay in taking necessary action. And as you'll see as we get a little deeper here, we may not always have the best solution, but there's the other part of that. We've got to act in time to save our bacon. So we have to act in a timely manner. Poor decision-making is a deadly airmanship flaw. So we've talked about judgment, decision-making, and I use those 2 terms interchangeably. and if we could just have put distinctions on them, but let's, for our discussion, just use them interchangeably. Judgment is the pinnacle of the whole airmanship model. So if it's not working, then your airmanship is flawed. It could be a fatal flaw. Airmanship can be viewed as a hedge against fatal errors because we're learning through airmanship, through developing our airmanship to higher and higher levels, how to identify where those dragons are lurking out there, and then how either to avoid those dragons or eliminate the dragons. That's what this is all about. So it's a hedge. When all airmanship elements are well developed and balanced, then this works. So you have to remember, we talked about this very early on in the series. You can't just develop, for example, one of your pillars of knowledge so that you have more knowledge than you'll ever need let's say, on your airplane. But you neglect self-knowledge, and you neglect knowledge of environment, and you neglect your skill and your proficiency. So it has to be balanced, and you don't want any one of those to be way out in front of the others, if you will. And that all is managed through that personal airmanship development plan that we've been talking about. Modern aviation technology can be seen as a condemnation of aviator decision-making. So you could look at this like, well, the bureaucrats or the aircraft designers or the folks that give us what we fly said, well, let's engineer a lot of these errors out of the system, and they did. But that really says that we're not very good decision makers. We got to automate. We got to put George in charge. And some early examples, and include those early autopilots and the early automated nav systems. That really did improve safety in a lot of ways, especially if you think about it, coupled approaches, ILS approaches down to low minimums. If you knew how to handle the equipment properly and it was, flying right, it tested and everything, it was a lot safer way to go. And it took a lot of the decision making out of, well, do I pull up, turn left, turn right, all that sort of thing. So that's an early example of this. And now, of course, highly automated cockpits, very, very automated cockpits. But as you've heard me say over and over, they'll kill you. They're a whole new set of dragons lurking in this new auto flight systems and avionics systems. So you have to learn where those dragons are and how to avoid them or how to slay them. And every one of these advances, though, really was prompted by accidents related to poor judgment. So the engineers are trying to help us, and I think they have, except we have to have the discipline and the good sense to learn how to use them properly and maintain our skill and proficiency in using them with recurrent training. So on the training and operational fronts, talking about the scope of poor judgment, checklists, policies, and procedures have become more and more directive all the time. So the flight management structure is trying to help us, because when flight management can and I include the FAA in this, especially for us personal flyers, when they can identify problems that are safety related, and they can identify a policy, a procedure, a checklist, a way to do a checklist that will either eliminate or help to mitigate that risk, then they make it a directive. They say, okay, you got to do it this way. Well, that's all good. That's all good, but that's not the whole story, as we'll see here. Organizations believe that rigid standardization is a partial answer to poor aviator judgment. And as you guys know, I flew for the airlines and the military, and this is a very true statement. The big organizations use standardization and rigid standardization, and they believe it's a partial answer, and I believe it's a partial answer too. But what needs to be underlined is partial. It's not the whole answer. Automation and standardization have led to a safer, more predictable flight environment. However, they may have inadvertently created pilots that rely too much on automation and checklists. And we've talked about this before. You've got to maintain your stick and rudder skills. You've got to maintain your thinking ability. You can't let the automation take the whole thing over. You've got to be way ahead of the automation, just like you have to be way ahead of the airplane. So, but the good news is, no problem. We know where those dragons are. We know how to train to avoid them. These aviators may be unprepared or caught off guard when they are required to make a tough decision on their own. So having that support network to help you with decisions, having your team is very important, a very good thing. But you, at the same time, through your personal airmanship development plan, have to make sure that you can make the best decisions possible by yourself, as an example here. Now, I guess the best way to sum up this particular topic we're on here is that neither automation nor rigid standardization is the complete answer. They have their place, they're part of the answer, but they're not the whole answer. We must strive for better judgment because not all aircraft are automated. So if we're relying on the automation, not all airplanes are automated. And of course, automation will fail. Increased automation can lead to new types and levels of complacency. I don't want to point fingers, but Northwest Airlines flying past Minneapolis is a good example. And it could happen to any of us if we rely too much on the automation. Judgment remains a critical skill, and it always will, or at least for a long, long time into the future. The human in the loop, exercising judgment properly, will still be required for the safest aviation system that we can put out there, and that's, of course, what we all want. So I have another question for you. Stand by. Do you think poor decision-making is a deadly airmanship flaw? Or can you get by with it, it won't kill you, or is it deadly? Okay, 100% have voted. Share. And of course, 100% of you said yes. And I just wanted to ask that question to reinforce in the mind, everybody's mind, that the reason we're doing this is self-preservation primarily. You know, we used to always have the saying in professional flying anyhow, that, you know, the little old lady stops by as she's getting on the airplane because the captain's standing in the cockpit doorway, and she says, "Oh, Captain, please be careful, you know, because I want to get there safely." And the captain says, "Ma'am, you don't have to worry about that. If I arrive alive, you'll arrive alive." So, but we have to realize that we are the people that make that determination whether we arrive alive. And all of this airmanship skill is really what gives us the ability to do that. All right. The judgment problem demands our individual attention. So we can rely on the organization to help us, but we have to be focused on it as individuals. The flight organizations can help, but the buck stops with each of us. This is our responsibility. Self-improvement begins with a basic understanding of how to approach this complicated and often confusing phenomenon we call pilot judgment. I'd like to just talk about this for a minute. You know, we've been hearing all this stuff for 20, 30 years that we've looked at here going through this webinar series. All the little elements have been there for a long time, but it's confusing. How do you put them together and make them work? It's like the FAA's approach, they call it aeronautical decision making. You know, I've been looking at that for quite a while. And if it's logical, makes a lot of sense, but I haven't studied it and then learned it like I would my standard operating procedures for an airplane. So I've got it ingrained. I do it automatically. And that's what we have to do. We have to be able to do it that way. But it is complicated and confusing, but we can learn it. Now, here's a good question. Is judgment an art or a science? Judgment should be viewed as both a science and an art. That's what Kern says, and I agree with that. And it's really an emerging science. You know, as we get more of this, I don't know if you guys follow what's happening over there in the medical engineering world, but that's just one of my areas of interest. I get a daily newsletter that tells me things about what's going on over there and what these guys can do now. For example, looking at the brain with these MRI machines, the functional fMRIs, so they can, while you're thinking, they can look at how your everything's lighting up and figure out what's going on. I mean, this is really becoming a science, but we're in the early stages of this. We're learning a lot that we can apply to airmanship, but there's still a whole lot more to learn, so that's kind of exciting too. But modern research has already revealed certain attributes, personality types, patterns of thought that can lead to improved decision making. So we already know what some of these things are. We can learn them and use them. But also, judgment should be viewed as an art, because aeronautical decision making cannot be reduced to an if-then formulas that fit all situations. Maybe someday, but then the computers will be flying it, and we can snooze or do whatever we want. But that as rapid progress as we're making there in that area, again, my belief, and I'm a futurist, I believe that we're going to have to keep the brain in the loop for at least another 50 years, maybe more. There is an intuitive side to pilot judgment. Here's another reason why I don't think HAL is going to take over anytime soon. This isn't only about running the if-thens and the ones and the zeros. It's a lot of intuitive. We've learned that a lot of accidents have been avoided or could have been avoided if the pilots had just listened to their gut a little bit, as we usually say. So there's an intuitive side to this. And decision making is an acquired skill, and it can be systematically developed through knowledge and practice. So again, this is not a mystery. It's not something you can think, oh yeah, those airline captains can do this, but I'll never be able to do it. Bunch of hooey. Any good pilot who works at it can learn to be a better and better decision maker. And by the way, I've been thinking about this a lot too. These same techniques work over there in your real life, not just in your flying life. They work in business. They work in interpersonal relationships. Being able to make better judgments is going to make your life better overall too. And you can use the same things that we're learning here for aeronautical decision making. Now, there are some steps to good judgment. Judgment cannot be achieved through a cookie cutter or checklist approach. We can learn things, but we can't pull out the old decision-making checklist because it's too dynamic a situation. It's too complicated. We have to rely on the old Mark I computer up there between the ears to do this. Judgment can and should be developed systematically. Again, Kern always comes back to this. Do it systematically. Do it continuously. So one, you develop the prerequisite structures of airmanship. So you have to learn the model, you have to work the model, you have to build up all of your levels of the bedrock principles and the pillars of knowledge and the situational awareness to get to that good judgment. You have to keep building them up, develop them. But that's a prerequisite. If you don't do that, you can't have good judgment. Then, number two, understand how aviators make decisions. So that's the process, the procedures we can learn, as well as the types of decisions that are made. And if you recall in the last webinar, we talked about flight risk assessment tools, FRATs. And here's a good example that defines the types of decisions that are made in general terms. And I think they were broken down, as I recall, the three categories: the pilot, the environment, and the aircraft as the general categories. So you have to understand that. So that's part of this. And number three, apply decision-making strategies. And there are strategies, processes, procedures that we can learn. I know it's a little late in the game here to say let's define judgment, but this is where Kern put it in the book. So I decided to leave it in this sequence. Here's the definition of judgment that Kern uses in redefining airmanship. He quotes Webster. It's the process of forming an opinion or evaluation by discerning or comparing. So I'd agree with that. That's a pretty good definition for our purposes. Kern kind of refines a little bit more. He says, judgment is the process of comparing and evaluating courses of action as defined by the pilot and the extended flight team. Now, he's trying to take into account here primarily multi-crew airplanes with a flight team, but this also could include, in my mind, dispatchers, your maintenance guys, you're part of your team, are part of this decision-making process. So, and he's talking about evaluating those courses of action so you're not just the only one thinking about them if you have a team. So I think that's an excellent definition. So judgment is the process of comparing and evaluating courses of action as defined by the pilot and the extended flight team. Now, the first step in this aeronautical decision making, if you will, is situation assessment. It's the critical first step towards consistent good judgment, is to effectively assess each situation. So as you go through courses to learn this and become better at it, you will learn. Step one, assess the situation. And this just reminded me, here's a good example. Every year at United, we would go through recurrent emergency evacuation training, which got more and more sophisticated over the years. Finally, in the later years, we had a cabin simulator with a cockpit that could be shaken around and tilted and looked like you had fire outside, and it killed the lights, and they even had stage smoke would come in. Really made it realistic. It was a great simulator for emergency evacuation. But they would make us repeat. And we always went through these classes. It was kind of fun. It was all the flight attendants and the pilots in one big class. We had maybe 100 people in one of these classes. And they'd make us all say it out loud like we were in kindergarten. Step one, assess the situation. So if you're going to open up an emergency exit, you look out the window to see if there's a fire out there, or if you're in the water. So step one's always assessing the situation. Assessment of a specific situation links overall situational awareness, the big picture, to a specific decision. So we've got to link those two together. If you recall last time talking about situational awareness. Now here's a real good rule of thumb to keep in mind. Ask yourself 3 simple questions. What is the nature of the problem? How much time do I have to work the problem? And what are the risks associated with this problem? So as you learn more about the actual process of decision-making, airmanship type decision-making, these are the 3 kind of general categories we're talking about. What's the nature of the problem? How much time do I have? And what are the risks? So here's some strategies for improving situation assessment. Develop an established cockpit scanning pattern. Whatever airplane you're flying, get in a regular habit pattern of looking around the cockpit in the same way. We call it the scan, of course. And you scan everything in that cockpit, including the door latches you go around, seat belts, are they secure? Every gauge in there, every readout you have, scan it, continuously scan it. Play devil's advocate with your situation. And the way I do this, I don't know how I came to this little mantra, if you will, to remind myself to do this. But every time I catch myself thinking about something else, or I've been away thinking about something else, like what the future is here, what's staying ahead of the airplane. When I come back to that cockpit, I say to myself, what's wrong with this picture? And then I look around to see what's wrong in the cockpit. And hopefully nothing is, but for some reason that works for me, reminds me to do it. It clicks in my mind, what's wrong with this picture? And it makes me then do that scan. But you have to have something that you have to continuously scan. You always have to be paranoid, thinking something's going to happen here, I've got to keep looking. And then, as Kern has pointed out, and as you've heard me say over and over, critique all events in detail. So anything that happens to you, that's golden. I mean, you're paying a lot to go out there and fly that airplane, and part of what you're paying for is the education you get out of it, what you learn. If that isn't part of the payoff for you, what you learn on every flight, then I suggest maybe you need a new hobby. But to get the most out of that, you got to critique it, and you have to critique it in detail. And of course, I'm an advocate of cockpit recording systems, flight data recording systems, so you can really critique it in detail. But you need to do that. It's part of this process. Now, assessing the situation, however, is only the first step in decision making. Once the problem and the future implications are understood, a plan of action must be devised. So at this point, think of it as a two-step process. Assess the situation, and then come up with a plan. Determining the alternatives for this plan, and that's important. Unless you're forced by time, that's why we ask ourselves the question early on, how much time do I have? If we're not, the more time we have, then we can think about more alternatives. Sometimes we don't have time to think about any alternatives. We got to go with what we have right now. But hopefully, the more time you have, and hopefully you have more time, you can think of alternatives. So, determining alternatives. As aviators, we are required to make many different types of decisions. We touched on that earlier. But all involve the choice between alternatives. Do I go or don't I go? Do I top the tanks, or do I really only need 30 gallons. Do I go with that? Well, what if the weather's not as good? So alternatives. We're always making these choices. Some situations require us to devise creative solutions to ill-defined problems. And we're going to focus on that here as we go through the next few slides. Coming up with a creative solution to an ill-defined problem is creative. It's tough to do. Some decisions require more mental effort than others, and we all know this. But be prepared, because sometimes you've got to give it your full attention to come up with that the right answer or the best answer. Now, we've got a couple different kinds of decisions, as Kern defines them. We have rule-based decisions. Rule-based decisions involve applying known rules to given situations. So, checklist kind of things. So known rules to given situations. And those are decisions we make to abide by those rules or not. Here's a good example. Good flight operations always say your approach must be stabilized by 500 feet AGL in VMC, or you must make a go-around. Then they define what stabilized means. So you, as the PIC, get to 500 feet and you're not stabilized. Well, you got to make a decision. Are you going to comply with the rules, or are you going to break the rules? So that's rule-based decision-making. Successful rule-based decision-making requires a solid understanding of the rules to be applied. So you got to know the rules. We talked about this in knowledge of environment. And again, coming to aviation, I can't think of many, if any, rules that are in the FARs, in the flight ops manuals of most operations, in the bylaws of flying clubs that aren't there for a reason that makes sense. So you've got to know those rules, though, before you can apply them. All of this simplifies decision-making. So rule-based decision-making is simpler than the other kind. But it still requires the aviator to make certain go, no-go decisions. You still are making decisions. Isn't just the rule says if, then, as an example about an unstabilized approach. The rules there are it's hard rule, but you still have to make that decision. Or to apply predetermined procedures after recognizing that a known rule applies. So you have to have all of this in the mix. Knowledge-based decisions. So we just looked at rule-based decisions. Now we're going to look at knowledge-based decisions. Knowledge-based decisions require solutions that go beyond procedural knowledge application. There are two types of knowledge-based decisions. Decisions required to solve a well-defined problems, and decisions required to solve ill-defined problems. And you'll see we can make this distinction and come up with approaches, strategies to each type. Solving ill-defined problems is the most challenging aspect of aeronautical decision-making, obviously, because you're often unable to determine the actual nature of the problem. Determining the nature of the problem is the first step in decision-making. So how can we even start this shiny new flies good decision-making process we just learned if we don't know what the problem is to make the decision about? So defining the nature of the problem is the first step. Ill-defined problems may or may not be clarified in the process of dealing with them. So sometimes we won't even finish figuring out what it is by the time we're on the ground and we're away from the airplane. We have to make the decisions even though we don't have a clear understanding of the problems. Ill-defined problems result from ambiguous cues. What's going on? Something's wrong with this picture. I can't quite put my finger on it. Two strategies may be used for coping with this type of situation. Manage the problem as if it were an emergency without clearly defining the problem, or diagnose and define the problem, then work out a solution. Of course, this number 2 presupposes you have enough time to do that. If you'll allow me to digress just for a second, I think I have an applicable war story here. I was flying a Conquest 2, which is a two-engine turboprop, hot little machine, nice airplane, in a two-pilot environment, co-pilot and a co-pilot. And we had the airplane in maintenance for 2 days, and we had to take the airplane out of maintenance literally at crack of dawn. Of course, it was wintertime, so it was dark later, but at the crack of dawn, we had to take off to reposition the airplane from where we were having the maintenance done to a departure point for a flight for this corporation. It was only about a 20-minute flight, but to be positioned for the departure, we had to take off at the crack of dawn. Now, the airplane had been in maintenance for 2 days. At the close of business the day before, I went over to the shop. This is a huge shop, not a mom and pop operation. And I went over everything with the maintenance guys and made sure all the paperwork was done right, and they had done all their inspection. I looked it all over as best I could, and so it was in a nice heated hangar. It's the middle of the winter. So the next morning we come out, we have them pull the pre-flight the airplane in the hangar. Everything looks good. Have them pull the airplane out before it gets too cold. We run out, jump in it, get our clearance, taxi out, take off, and as we're climbing through about 10,000 feet, literally the sun was rising for us, just coming over the horizon. So we're starting to squint because we're going just about right into the sun, going from Battle Creek to Akron, Canton. And all of a sudden my co-pilot says, "What's that?" You don't want to hear that from anybody you're flying with, but she said, "What's that?" I said, "What's what?" And she says, "There on the right nacelle just behind the prop." I looked out at the right nacelle, and here's this kind of coffee brown liquid trailing back slowly, so it was pretty viscous, I could tell, across the top of the nacelle. Could have been grease, because it had a gearbox in there and prop and all that, controllable pitch prop, or it could have been oil. I couldn't tell what it was. Okay? So, not a clearly defined problem. So I decided, though, to handle it as an emergency, and I shut it down per the emergency checklist, did the cleanup items, declared an emergency, turned around, went back and landed at Battle Creek under an emergency situation, and everything worked out fine. Taxied up, they pulled it in the hangar, and maintenance guys are all over the airplane, and what had happened was when part of the maintenance that was done, routine maintenance, they had to top off the grease in the prop hub. And they had not tightened down the grease fitting properly after they did this. I don't know why it was loose, or maybe it was loose, they just didn't check it. Those things are supposed to be torqued, though. And so, of course, it spins, so, a lot of force on it. Well, somewhere after takeoff, it had left the airplane. Luckily, it didn't do any damage leaving the airplane, but it now allowed the grease in the hub to start leaking back, and that's what we saw. So that was an ill-defined problem that I handled as an emergency. Everything worked out great. So that's an example of what we're talking about here. I didn't take time to diagnose the problem. I didn't sit there thinking, well, is it oil or is it grease? I didn't take time to look over at the oil pressure gauge to see if maybe it was going down. I determined something was wrong over there, and the best way to handle it was do the emergency procedure. Now, the situation was such that I could do fine without that engine. We're up, just my co-pilot, myself, lightly loaded, 10,000 feet on a winter day. I could have probably done loops on one engine with that airplane. It had plenty of power. So the environment was such that was not part of the risk that I had to assess. Now, there are some hazards to decision-making that we need to point out. So let's look at those for a minute. One of them is the strength of an idea, as Kern calls it. The mind seeks to resolve conflict or ambiguity. So that's built into our programming in our brain. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like conflict, most of us. Some people do. Most of us don't like conflict. So if there's conflicting information coming into our Mark I computer, it's programmed, it's hardwired to get rid of that conflict or ambiguity, figure it out. So we want to figure it out. And we can lose track of the time, for example, if we're not careful. So keep in mind we're hardwired to do that. This tendency can override your good judgment. So in other words, your judgment might be saying, or the good judgment might be, shut that engine down, but I'm seeing something out there on that nacelle. I'm not sure what it is, so that's ambiguity. So I'm going to sit here and think about it, or I'm going to look into it, I'm going to do inquiry, I'm going to try to figure out what it is, when that's not the thing to do. And this can occur in a time-critical situation. I think primarily what we're talking about here, the strength of an idea pops up, and you're going to grab onto it because you don't have much time. Or in the case of excessive professional deference, let's say you're flying with a senior instructor, and the instructor says, here's what we ought to do about that problem. And you don't question it, you don't inquire, given there's enough time. Because, well, he or she has a whole bunch more experience than me, so I'm going to defer to what they think about all this. That's what I mean by excessive professional deference. Still with decision-making hazards, groupthink is another hazard. There are some circumstances in which the group does not perform as well as the individual. Again, Kern is mainly talking here about multi-crew aircraft, when the crew isn't operating properly, but this could also come into the type of team that we've been talking about, especially if we have a dispatch team or a maintenance team and that sort of thing. A single person may hold the piece of vital information needed to resolve the problem. But if that person, for example, is not assertive, it is likely they will withhold information that might tend to cause conflict in the group. So again, if we're going to operate in a team, the team has to train. The team has to operate as a team. And know if someone is not an assertive type, they have to know that they have to be assertive in that team environment to make it work. Still with decision-making hazards, we also have what Kern calls scheduling hazards. I call them timeline hazards. Situation assessment and decision-making must be followed by action. So it doesn't do us any good to assess it, to make a decision, unless we act on it. Many good decisions are delayed beyond the point of usefulness or jumped at prematurely, so equally dangerous, which again is a balancing act for us when we make these decisions. We've got to make them in a timely manner, but we don't want to make them before we have to. In fact, I just I had breakfast this morning with Vern Jobst, who's was a retired United pilot. He was about 15 years senior to me at United, so I knew Vern my whole career there. And he is a pretty well-known DPE here in Chicago area. He's currently the president of the Chicago Flight Instructors Association. So we were swapping war stories this morning at breakfast and stuff. And it reminded me, I kidded him a little bit, we got talking about some of this airmanship stuff. And I said, yeah, Vern, it's like the old captains. Like you old captains used to always teach me. The key to flexibility is indecision. So not making that decision until you have to is important, but then knowing when you have to is way more important. And here's an interesting physiological factor. Adrenaline release caused by an emergency can cause temporal distortion. That's the technical term. Time stretches. We've all either experienced it or heard about it, read about it with guys who get into emergency situations. Time seems to slow down, and that's good in some cases because that means we're speeding up. But we can misjudge how much time we have to solve a problem. So we have to be aware that that can catch us. It's a hazard. So we have to come up with a clock-based, if you will, schedule. We got to say, okay, here's the plan, and here's when we have to do it. Okay, I've just decided that when my fuel gets down to 23 gallons, if I'm not within 50 miles of my destination, I am going to divert to XYZ over here. So that's clock-based, if you will, type of decision-making. Here's another hazard, seeking the perfect solution. Some of us are more prone to chasing a perfect solution to an in-flight challenge. So I'm prone to this. I'm always looking for that perfect solution. I don't like half solutions. But we have to be careful. I have to be careful of that because sometimes I can't take the time or maybe there's just not enough information to ever get to that perfect solution. But we should not always be interested in finding the best possible answer to a given situation. But not always, Kern says. We should overall look for the best possible answer, but sometimes, especially in time critical, that's not the best solution. We should find a solution that works in a timely manner. So that's the bottom line of that whole discussion. And here's another decision-making hazard, hidden agendas. Poor judgment is often caused by the drive to accomplish a personal objective or hidden agenda. And the example I like to use of this hazard is you're going for an instrument rating, and you're working on that, and you've got a dual session set up with your instructor, and you look at the weather, and you're just still, let's say you're a third of the way through your training. You're pretty good at flying instruments, but your approaches still need a lot of work, and you're staying ahead of the airplane. Situational awareness needs a lot of work and all that, which is about where you'd be at that point. And you check the weather for the flight in the afternoon a couple hours before you're going to go out to the airport and do this training session, and it's 501 mile in the area where you're going to be flying, and forecast to be that way. Well, it's legal because the instructor, instrument instructor who's current on instruments, and he's going to, and for the purposes of legality for IFR flight, he'll be the pilot in command, so you can go do it. But you're thinking, wow, if that flight instructor drops over dead, I don't think I can get myself back down on the ground alive. I'm just not to that point yet. I mean, you might be right, very right about that. On the other hand, you might, if you've been trained properly, you'll declare an emergency and have an emergency procedure for getting yourself out of that. But let's just say, in this case, well, in any case, that is a risk factor you have to evaluate. So you call up your instructor and say, well, I don't think so. It doesn't look too good. And the instructor says, oh, no, this is part of how we do it. I won't sign you off for your instrument check ride unless you've got at least 10 hours of actual instrument time with me. Well, I don't have any argument with that. I'd argue about that weather for a single-engine airplane, but I wouldn't argue about that not being a good idea to get, as we call it, a wet certificate. But now, is that instructor doing it for you, or is this a young instructor who wants to build flight time? And their assessment of risk, the younger we are, we know, and the less experienced we are, we know, we assess risk differently than a mature person will. So, and mature also in the sense of piloting experience, not necessarily age. So that instructor might have a personal agenda that's not good for us. We have to recognize that's a possibility, identify it as a potential risk factor, evaluate that risk factor, as we talked about when we covered the pillar of knowledge risk. Also, we all know about a classic example is get there-itis. That's our own hidden agenda. The traditional antidote for this decision-making hazard is to tell yourself that it's better to be late than never. So if you kind of think, you get that gut feeling, maybe I have my own hidden agenda or this other person does, better off being late or never taking off, in our case, than never getting there. I think this one more here, decision-making hazard. There are knowledge and experience hazards. Our decision-making process tends to gravitate towards areas of knowledge we are comfortable with. To a hammer, the world looks like it's a nail. If we are really, really good at electrical systems, if we get a warning light, we probably start our assessment process with, all right, what's the electrical system doing? Is that a stray electron doing that? So, but if we are a hydraulic kind of guy, and it's a red light on hydraulic system, we probably don't even think about it. Might be an electrical short first, turning that light on. We start thinking about the hydraulic system. So this is a fact. We tend to gravitate that way with what we know, towards what we know. But it's also, so that's another reason why it's important for us to keep balance in our 5 pillars of knowledge. With experience, we develop internal models with which to make routine decisions more automatic. This is part of experience. We want to make as much automatic as possible, but we got to have also the checks and balances on our own internal automatics too. This can create a mindset that leads us to see what we expect rather than what is. And other things, physiological things, psychological things, factors, can cause us to see what we expect to see, and that might not be reality. So that's a hazard, the decision making. All right, that's the quick pass through all the information in this chapter of redefining airmanship that I wanted to go over. But there's a great case study here that I think that's not in the book. I pulled this out of the NTSB database that I think illustrates a lot of this. And I like case studies. I know you guys do. I asked this earlier. People want to see case studies. I said more and more. So let's finish up this evening by going through this case study, and I think it points up a lot of things we've been talking about, not only about judgment, but about the whole, all of the elements in the Kern Airmanship model. All right, here's the setup. This accident occurred on February 8, 2008, so middle of winter. It was the accident aircraft was a 1948 Cessna 140. Now that's a file photo, so I'm not sure that was the airplane. I'd cry if that was the airplane. Isn't that a beautiful 140? I love these. I owned a Cessna 120 back when I first started flying. My first airplane that I bought when I was 18 was a 7AC Champ, and then I had that for about 6 months and sold it to a flying club that had a Cessna 120, and part of the deal was they gave me a membership in the club, so I had that Cessna 120 to fly as my move-up airplane from the Champ, and it had artificial horizon and all that good stuff, an old narco radio, and boy, I felt like an airline pilot. That was a neat little airplane. So, but in any case, this was an antique 1948 Cessna 140, the accident airplane. The pilot was the sole occupant of the airplane. It was a fatal crash. The pilot was 54-year-old, and he held an airline transport pilot license, certificate, excuse me. He also had seaplane and commercial helicopter ratings. He had Ford type ratings and transport category aircraft. So this was not an amateur pilot. He had 21,000 hours total flight time, and he was currently flying for a major airline as a captain. So again, not an amateur. He probably had been flying quite a bit prior to the accident. He had no accident, incident, or enforcement or disciplinary actions in his file, so looked like a good airman. He had bought the Cessna 140 the morning of the accident. Warning, warning, first red light. He just bought the airplane. How much knowledge of that airplane did he have? Even if he knew a 140 very well, from his old days of flying, or even from any kind of prior experience, how well did he know this 140? He planned to fly back home to Fulton, Missouri for a family event. So here we go, red light again. Get their itis. There was something he wanted to get to, presumably, that same day that he was supposed to get to. The previous owner reported that the pilot was aware that the annual inspection had lapsed. So here another warning light. He had just ignored, he was just ignored the warning that he was about to operate outside of an established procedure. He was going to fly an airplane that was not airworthy in the technical sense. Violating an established procedure. Warning light. And this was kind of verified because he didn't file for a ferry permit, which is what he would have had to do in this case. The airplane departed Richmond, Wisconsin, which is just east of the Twin Cities up in Minnesota, but it's just across the border there in Wisconsin, at 12:11 Central. So middle of the day in the winter, so it was light. He had a planned fuel stop in Oskaloosa, Iowa, pretty much straight south. There was a 236-mile leg, so that's about 2.5 hours roughly in that airplane, depending on the wind. So pretty long leg, middle of the winter. As I recall, that cabin heater didn't work too well in those airplanes. His final destination, of course, was home, Fulton, Missouri. The total flight plan distance was 380 miles. So that's probably something like over 4 hours of flying that day in this little airplane in cold weather. And so all of the factors now are starting to build up that we have seen earlier on as we've come through the model now, that are warning signs, caution warning signs. The surface observations confirmed the widespread IFR conditions along the route. And the pilot was presumably aware of this because, there was also an advisory for moderate icing below 8,000. because he got, the evening before, he pulled up 3 duet weather briefings. So they know that he knew what this weather was forecast to be. All predicted instrument meteorological conditions for most of his route. So that was the forecast. And 3 times he got that forecast. Now here's the real kicker. The only attitude instrument in the Cessna's panel was a Venturi-powered turn and bank indicator. Now for you young pilots, you've probably seen these instruments in the museums. I have flown a lot of hours, instrument hours, behind these instruments. Once you learn how to use them, and these instruments were the kind that Jimmy Doolittle first showed us how that you could fly under the hood in instrument conditions. He used this kind of instrument, but they went away with the turn coordinator, which is easier to use, but very similar in terms of difficulty. But this is more difficult to fly, the turn and bank indicator. It's significant that it was Venturi powered. That means this is a picture of a Venturi tube, if you don't know what that is. We used to have these bolted onto the outside airplanes, and of course, like all Venturi tubes, it created a vacuum or a low pressure area here in the restriction, which then created a suction to drive the gyro in the turn and bank. So it wasn't even electrical. The problem with these was they were never consistent, depended on the air going through the Venturi. That was one of the problems with them. Very sensitive, bounced back and forth. You flew them by averaging out their indications, and of course, the inclinometer worked the same as on the turn coordinator. The aircraft was not equipped with an artificial horizon or even a DG. The only navigation equipment aboard was a handheld GPS. So he had good basic VFR navigator, handheld GPS, as we all know, would do a good job. No flight plan was filed. It wasn't required, but if you look at the weather, I kind of start thinking now, well, maybe he's starting to cover his tracks. He doesn't want to file a flight plan, so the FAA could go look and say, why did this guy file a VFR flight plan in this kind of weather? So I think he was starting to become a rogue aviator here and violate the rules. Here's another sign of it. The pilot never made contact with air traffic control. Never asked for flight following, which, again, is normally a good idea. He was trying to fly under the radar. When he took off from New Richmond, the weather was barely qualified as marginal VFR. It was 1,500 overcast and 1.25 miles in light snow. And even in the middle of the day, that time of year, that kind of lighting, depending on how thick those clouds were, but there was icing up at least, through below 8,000 feet. So it's probably cloudy at least that high. That it was probably pretty dim light down at the bottom of that. Probably pretty bad visibility. And the conditions were significantly lower farther south along his route, and he knew that. So it wasn't a case of, well, I'll just scud run here. I'll stay under it here. Only got to get 20 miles down the road, and then I can pop up to good weather. He knew it was going to get worse as he went south. The airport closest to the accident site, which was, we'll talk about where that was in a second, reported overcast skies at 400 feet. So in the accident area, he had 400 overcast, 1.5 miles visibility, and mist, and a 1 degree temperature dew point spread. It could have been actual foggy 0-0 in patches when it's that close. The aircraft crashed near Grand Meadows, Minnesota. And here you can see it again, pretty much straight south on his track down to the refueling stop. Made it about 120 miles, so it's a little more than an hour that he got away with this scud running and dodging things below the clouds. But then the airplane impacted level ground, nose low while banking to the left. Nose low while banking to the left, not in level flight. The 300-foot debris field suggested that it hit at flying speed. Oops, excuse me. The main wreckage was found just 100 yards from a field of 400-foot wind turbines. So you'll see that NTSB tied this in. They think this is part, one of the links in the accident chain, the air chain leading the accident. This wind farm, those blades were sticking right up into it. So imagine that. You're down, hugging the ground, 100 feet, 200 feet below the clouds. Visibility is only about 1 mile. It's starting to dim up on you. It's getting a little later in the afternoon. And you're flying along over this flat ground pretty much, and all of a sudden here's this picket fence of these huge wind turbines pop up in front of you, and they're just less than a mile out when you finally figure out what they are and react. That day, their blades would have reached the bottoms of the clouds. Investigators found no evidence that the Cessna hit any of the wind turbines, so it wasn't a collision with the wind turbines that did it. Data recovered from the GPS suggested that it tracked the direct line from New Richmond to Oskaloosa at altitudes from 300 to 600 feet AGL. So he was coming down there, he was low the whole way, 300 to 600 feet. Then about 2 minutes before the crash, then things changed. It abruptly turned 90 degrees to the left and flew east for about a minute. So he was going south, made a 90-degree turn to the left, went east for about a minute. So that could say to you, an abrupt turn, oh, he saw those towers and he made a steep left bank. And you could think, if it crashed right there, you'd say, well, maybe he got an accelerated stall, spun in. But there's more to the story. After it made that abrupt left turn, it made a figure 8 turn at altitudes between 900 and 1,500 feet AGL. That was well above the reported ceiling, so he was obviously in the clouds. So he was IFR. My guess is when he saw the wind turbines, he pulled, which would be the natural reaction. And he went up into it, and then he realized or remembered or whatever, oops, I only have a turn and bank. Now, how long do you think it had been since that airline captain had gotten proficient on flying a little airplane like that on only, as we called it, needle ball and airspeed? Not even a DG. A long, long time, I can bet you. And you can get very good at flying those turn and bank indicators. When I was an Army helicopter instructor, I primarily did instrument instructing. And I'd go out with my students, who were all, of course, rated helicopter pilots, and we'd go out and fly in the clouds as much as we could because we were getting ready to go to Vietnam. We were training up for it, and we were getting serious about this. We fly in some pretty bad weather, and we flew partial panel in the bad weather. We got it down to needle ball, airspeed, altimeter, whiskey compass, and ADF, shoot the ADF approach. And we got really good at it, but it took a lot of practice, and we had to be very proficient at it, and that skill dies quickly. So I would bet this guy hadn't done that in eons, flowing needle ball airspeed. And now here he was, and he's in it. And he wandered around a little bit, and then he lost control. The report doesn't specify whether the wind farm was depicted in that GPS database. Maybe he knew it was there, but that straight line that he was flying, he probably didn't, or he probably should have dog-legged around it, you would think. The sudden emergence of towers reaching in the clouds must have come as an unpleasant surprise. That's an understatement. Scared the bejesus out of them, no doubt. The FAA civil, this is an interesting aspect too. The FAA Civil Aeromedical Institute in Oak City performed a toxicology test like they usually do. No carbon monoxide was found, no cyanide was found in the blood, and no ethanol was detected in the blood. So it wasn't a drinking problem. It wasn't impaired. However you pronounce that, diphenhydramine, excuse me for that poor pronunciation, was present in urine but not detected in blood. I don't know what difference that makes. That chemical is an over-the-counter antihistamine with sedative effects. So he was impaired to some degree by the sedatives. Ibuprofen was also detected in his urine. And ibuprofen, as we all know, is an over-the-counter anti-inflammatory drug, and it can treat these other things too. So he was self-medicating. He was impaired to some degree. Might have had a cold. Looks like maybe he had a cold. So again, this kind of guy should have known better. He wasn't really fit to fly that day. So all these links in this error chain built up to this accident. There's no knowing how often pilots sneak below the scud. Now, I will admit to, as a younger aviator, scud running as a routine thing back in the old days. Did it all the time. Did it a lot in the Army and helicopters, but the mission required that. And you can get pretty good at this. but it's high risk, always has been high risk, always will be high risk, but you've got to know how to do it, and here's another, it's a skill. In the Army, we train for it. We call it nap of the earth, NOE, flying, to avoid enemy contact was how they taught it, why they taught it. And there are skills involved to reduce the risk somewhat, but we don't go out and practice that as personal flyers, so it's a rusty skill at best when we do it. And nobody knows how often this is being done out there every day, but it's probably still quite a bit. A lifetime of flying may have left this particular pilot so much at ease in the air that coaxing a slow airplane over flat country seemed like a reasonable risk to him. Heck, he flies those big jets for the airlines, 21,000 hours. I can, that little puddle jumper there, that 140, I could fly that in my sleep with my eyes closed. So, that might have been part of his, he overestimated his capabilities for this particular level of airmanship that was required for this flight. Even when ceilings drop below the 500 feet of altitude required above uncongested terrain, this guy kept going. Now, as you know, you're going to catch me. Wait a minute, Dave. Over uncongested terrain, it's only 500 feet away from people or property, which is true. But basically, when you get down below 500 feet in a mile, you don't know if you're going to fly right over a farmhouse or not. So he was violating the reg. But low ceilings and marginal visibility leave little margin for error or time to react to the unexpected. So again, in our problem solving, assess the situation. Oops, I'm going to hit these wind turbines. In this case, no time for assessing alternatives. It had to be reaction in this case, and apparently his reaction was full. Thousands of hours in the logbook won't soften the impact of the aircraft once it runs out of airspace, once it hits the ground. So no matter how many hours you have, you're not immune to this kind of a problem if you're not following the disciplines and the procedures and using good airmanship all the time. Now, it's tempting to think of VFR into IMC flight as the province of low-time pilots. That's how I think about it most of the time when I think about this problem. How can we train guys to avoid it? But it's really a rookie mistake by aviators too experienced to realize how quickly they could lose control without visual references. So, again, it's been a long time since he saw how much recent proficiency, recent skill it takes to fly needle-ball airspeed, or how fast obstructions come rushing up out of 1 mile visibility. Unless you get out there and do this, this is a theory, how fast, and I can tell you, and if you've done it, 1 mile visibility, especially under poor lighting conditions, things like towers become pretty much invisible. So the evidence says otherwise, that this is a low-time pilot problem. Over the past 10 years, 1/3 of all VFR and IMC accidents involve commercial or airline transport pilots. So even if you're a very experienced pilot, don't say you're so experienced this one's in your past. If you get out there and scud do some scud running, you can get it just like the low-time guy. Neither higher certificate levels nor hours in the logbook mitigate those consequences of buying that farm. 80% of these accidents are fatal. So if you get out there, you do it, and it doesn't work for you, you're probably going to die. So let's let me ask you some questions about this case study. I think that was very interesting, covered a lot of ground. But let me ask you a few questions. Here's the first one. Again, I apologize for the length of time it takes me, but I have to rigidly follow my cockpit procedures to launch these poll questions. What bedrock principles did the pilot neglect? Please select all that apply. Okay, everybody's voted. I'm going to close it and share it with you. So everybody says that he violated all three. I agree. I think he had flawed flight discipline, obviously, go, no-go decision, all that. His skills were not up to the level required for this particular flight, and a glaring example is the not be able to fly partial panel. And, of course, his proficiency in all these areas was not where it should have been. So very good, very good. Second question that I have for you now. Stand by. It's coming. Which of the pilot's pillars of knowledge, the 5 pillars of knowledge, appear to have been weak in this situation? And click select all that apply. Okay, everybody's voted. And 100% say his knowledge of self was weak, his knowledge of his aircraft was weak, knowledge of team was weak. And I would assume that some of you didn't rate that as something that happened or that it was weak because he didn't have a team. But in effect, he didn't work his team properly. That the briefer and so on and so forth. Flight brief, FSS brief. I understand what you're saying there. Environment and risk. Yes, I would agree with all of those others that he was weak in every area. And again, I think he was weak in the team effort too. All right. And there's the next question. I'll put it up as a poll question. How would you characterize the pilot's situational awareness? And just select one. Was the situational awareness excellent, adequate for the flight, just poor, or woefully lacking? Okay, everybody's voted. Close, and I'll share it. Everybody, woefully lacking. Yes, I agree. And I have another one. This is the last one in this little series here. How would you rate the pilot's judgment? Was it excellent, adequate, poor, or woefully lacking? Okay, everybody's voted. I'll close, share it, and everybody agrees woefully lacking. Even though he was a 21,000-hour airline captain, woefully lacking. Okay, well, here's the takeaways that I suggest you focus on for this particular session. The foundations and pillars of knowledge of airmanship form the basis for good judgment and decision making. So we can't have good judgment and decision making without having those foundations and the pillars. All good judgment and decision making is grounded in accurate situation assessment. So first of all, we have to have the knowledge, and then we have to assess the situation accurately. Judgment is not a magical quality. It's not something we're born with. We learn it, and we can learn aeronautical judgment very easily because there's so much to help us, so many tools we can use, so many ways that we can learn it, that we can do it. It can be taught and learned. The improvement process demands disciplined attention and constant self-critique. So if you aren't going to be disciplined about this, focus on it, and have constant self-critique, planned, systematic, then you're not going to learn this. You have to do it that way. In the final analysis, our judgment is as good as we want to make it. We can become very, very good at it, or we can ignore it and gamble on our flying. So once again, I would give one more sales pitch. You guys would think I was getting a commission on selling these books, but I'm not, unfortunately. I wish I was. But I would emphasize again, please read the book if you're serious about airmanship excellence. As much as we've covered in the Redefining Airmanship series, in the Kern Airmanship Model and Detail series, there's still a lot more in the book. And one of the things that there is a lot more of is case studies. And the case studies help to understand all of these things. They're excellent. Oops, I'm sorry. I have one final question for you here, the final question in the whole series. And down the road, would you like to see more airmanship-related wings program events? I'm inclined to develop other programs like this focusing on airmanship excellence and airmanship development, but I haven't made a decision to do that yet. So I want to just test the interest here on, are you guys interested in learning more about this, going deeper, looking at it from a different angle and so forth. Okay, everybody's voted. I'll close it and share it. And oh darn, I've got more work to do. Okay, well, thank you for asking for more. And I enjoy doing this. I learn a lot by putting this together. As many years as I've been doing this, I've been flying airplanes. You know, as you've heard me say, there's always something more to learn. And this is really the zen of flying. This is the, you know, beyond the black belt stuff. So I enjoy, you know, clarifying my thinking, learning new things, learning new ways to teach this stuff. So I will more than likely put together some more webinar series. So if you have any questions or comments at this point, please raise your hand, and we'll take just a second to answer them or let you make a comment. I'll give you just a second to think about it. Okay, it looks like nobody wants to say anything or ask anything right now. But again, as I always say, here's my contact information, and I'm always open to talk about airmanship. We want to make these programs better. If you have a question, remember it's the same old thing. If you have a question about airmanship or what we've talked about, you think it's a dumb question, I guarantee you a bunch of other guys have the same question. And if we haven't answered that question, then we might not even know the question is there. So if you have questions, suggestions, comments, here's how you get in touch with me. And I would encourage you again to go over and register on Captain Dave's Hangar. Register for the, so you're get notified whenever there's blog postings, and you register for airmanship updates on the Airmanship Excellence website. We're going to be migrating both the blog and the website to different servers here over the course of the next couple of weeks, but should be seamless to you. But I would suggest that if you haven't plugged into these things and you intend to, you know, encourage you to do it before you forget about it again. So I'm going to leave you with the same thought that I have been leaving you with what Colonel / now General Yeager says about if you're going to fly, do it right.